Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson. And before we conclude our study of Matthew's parables, Jesus' parables in Matthew, I should say, with the final two, um, I want us to introduce the eschatological sermon, the end time sermon that Jesus delivers in Matthew chapters 24 and 25, which contain these last two parables. I think it's important for us to introduce the sermon itself um, before we study the two parables that are the last two parables Jesus tells in Matthew's gospel. It's the final week, it's coming to the end of the final week in Matthew chapter 24. And Matthew makes clear that that last week, the week that began with the triumphal entry and that ends with um, Jesus' crucifixion, during that week at night, Jesus is staying not in Jerusalem, but in Bethany, which is just 2 miles away. It's just on the other side of the Mount of Olives. And of course, we know he had very dear friends there. It's where Mary and Martha and Lazarus lived. And maybe he was staying with them or staying at the home of Simon, who hosted a meal for him in Bethany. But Bethany is a place where he's welcome. And that's where he's staying the night. And in the evening, as they're crossing, they're you know, climbing the Mount of Olives, which was a public park, I should say. The Garden of Gethsemane was a public park, not the whole mount, but there was a famously olive groves there. There was a famous olive press there. That's what Gethsemane means. It means olive press that produced olive oil. And Herod had planted in the Garden of Gethsemane this public space, this beautiful space there, and that's where Jesus is going to be arrested. In just a day or two. Anyway, um, so so they're going back over the hill at the end of the day, and they pause to look back on the city of Jerusalem and the magnificence of Herod's temple complex. Herod, this is the second temple, the temple that the returnees built after coming back from Babylon, which was a bit underwhelming, at least for people who remembered Solomon's temple. You can read about that in in um, in um, in the prophets. But anyway, in Ezra and Nehemiah. Um, anyway, um, Herod had built this enormous campus around it. It was magnificent. It was a tourist attraction, and it was not very old. It had only been completed for a few decades. It was newer to them than the Iwo Jima Memorial would be to us. It was not much older to them than the World War II Memorial in DC would be to us. And so they're looking back on these magnificent buildings, Solomon's porch, all of it, and they're marveling at the beauty of it. Most of these guys are from Galilee, you know, and so uh, and so they're as tourists almost marveling at how beautiful it all is, looking back on it at the end of the day. And as they're doing this, Jesus says to them in Matthew 24, verse 2, excuse me, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here shall be left upon another, which shall not be torn down. Now that's stunning to them. And so they asked these two questions. As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately and said, tell us, when will be these things? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And Jesus answered and said to them, see to it that no one misleads you. I want to stop there. So they think they're asking one question because they cannot separate out the destruction of Jerusalem with the end of time and the coming of Jesus, your coming. Now, I've often wondered, do they mean a second coming, or you know, when he finally demonstrates his glory? I don't know, but they are conflating in their own minds the destruction of Jerusalem with the final day of the Lord. Day of the Lord being a theme throughout Old and New Testament. And Jesus makes clear those are two different things. And he makes clear about that in this sermon. And that's why he begins by saying, let no one mislead you. And then he starts talking about the end of the city of Jerusalem. Sometime in the early to mid 60s, well, late 50s to early 60s, the zealots and the more radical elements of Judaism increase in power. They take control. About the same time that Peter and Paul are executed in Rome, the Jews expel the Romans from the city of Jerusalem. The Romans, as one might expect, respond with a massive force. They lay siege to the city of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is destroyed in AD 70, and along with it, Old Testament Judaism is destroyed. The Mosaic system is destroyed, never to return again. We're destroyed with the iron fist of Rome. God accomplishes this as is necessary to make sure that people are not trying to replace the new covenant with the old. Of course, people still try, but it's impossible. You cannot keep Old Testament Judaism the way we can keep New Testament Christianity. You can't. The mechanisms do not exist. It's impossible. God made it so. And so this is an important question for them, and it's important, and Jesus' answer is important to them as well, because some of them will be alive when it happens. But then he switches to talk about the end of time, and he makes that switch um, in verse 36. He says of the second coming, but of that day and hour no one knows, not the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father alone. He has given them lots of signs to be aware of, so that when the moment of the destruction of Jerusalem comes, they can be prepared. But then he says, of my coming, nobody knows. The angels don't know. I don't know. Only the Father knows. Only the Father knows that. I don't know it. Does Jesus know it now? I can't answer that question, but when he spoke these words, he didn't know when it was going to be. And that means they don't know, and that means we don't know, and that we have not been given any clues to when the second coming is going to be. Throughout the New Testament, we're told, read 2 Peter chapter 3, it's going to happen when we least expect it. And it's something that Jesus himself emphasizes in chapters 24 and 25. And and of course, this sermon ends with the scene of judgment. And that's how we know he's now talking about final judgment. For some of us will enter into the joy of the Lord eternally, and others will be cast out. And where we learn that heaven is made for us, into the joy prepared for you before the foundation of the world, and that hell was never intended for us. It was intended for the devil and his angels. Depart from me into the punishment that was prepared for the devil and his angels, verse 41. Okay, that's what this sermon is about. That's how it begins, that's how it ends. It's really an answer to two different questions that they asked while they were sitting on top of the Mount of Olives, looking back on the city of Jerusalem, there on the last week that Jesus was alive. We will look at the two parables he tells them in this sermon over the next two sessions, and then we'll have a concluding session, and we'll move on to our next topic. Okay, thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word.